My farm was more than just a piece of land. It was my heritage, passed down from my grandfather. It was a 100-acre sanctuary on the outskirts of a growing suburban development. The land thrived under my care. Orchards heavy with fruit, rows of vegetables swaying in the breeze, and wildflowers painting the fields in bursts of color. It was a refuge, a place where nature and hard work intertwined. But the HOA didn't see it that way. It started with a knock on my door one crisp autumn morning. Margaret Winslow stood on my porch, her polished shoes pristine against the dust of my land. She was the self-appointed ruler of the Winslow Estates HOA, and the smug confidence in her stance told me she believed she was here to dictate terms. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice as sharp as the creases in her blazer, "we need to talk about your property." I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "We don't actually. I'm not part of your HOA." She smiled, the kind that never reached the eyes. "That's where you're mistaken. The Winslow Estates Board has been reviewing property designations, and your land has been identified as a public botanical feature. According to HOA guidelines, that means it falls under our jurisdiction." I stared at her, trying to gauge whether this was a bad joke. "A public botanical feature?" She nodded, unfazed. "Your land is a large green space that enhances the visual appeal of the neighborhood. That classification allows us to ensure it remains accessible and well-maintained." I let out a short laugh. "You mean you want to control my farm?" Margaret didn't blink. "It's a matter of community interest. We've already approved a proposal to add walking paths, signage, and limited public access for our residents." My hands tightened into fists. "You can't do that. This land has been in my family for generations. You have no right." She pulled out a document from her leather-bound folder. "This notice outlines the HOA's decision. We expect your cooperation." I didn't take the paper. I didn't need to read it to know they had no intention of asking nicely. "You need to leave," I said, voice low and steady. "And take that with you." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "Mr. Carter, I'd advise you to reconsider. The HOA has significant influence. If you refuse to comply, there will be consequences." I stepped forward, forcing her to take a step back. "Get off my land." She turned on her heel, walking back toward her gleaming black sedan. Before getting in, she called over her shoulder, "You'll regret this." The dust kicked up as she sped away. But I wasn't intimidated. I had fought for this land before, and I'd do it again. I just didn't realize how far the HOA was willing to go. That afternoon, I found a sign staked into my driveway. The bold letters read, "Winslow Estates Public Botanical Garden. Open to residents." A slow burn of anger crept up my spine. They weren't just pushing boundaries. They were declaring war. This wasn't over. Margaret and her HOA cronies had declared war on my land, but they underestimated me. If they thought I'd roll over and let them turn my farm into their weekend playground, they were in for a rude awakening. I contacted property rights attorney the next morning, a sharp-witted woman named Diana Harper. After reviewing the document, she tapped her manicured nails against my kitchen table and smirked. "They're bluffing." They seemed pretty confident for a bluff. She leaned back. "Legally, they don't have a solid claim, but that won't stop them from making your life miserable while they try to push this through. You need to be ready." She wasn't wrong. Within a week, the HOA escalated their invasion. One morning, I woke up to find a brand new sign installed at the end of my driveway. "Winslow Estates Public Botanical Garden. Open to residents." Fury boiled in my chest. They had no right. Later that day, HOA contractors showed up with shovels and stakes, marking out a walking path through my orchard. I confronted them, demanding they leave, but they shrugged. "We have HOA authorization," one of them said smugly. "You should take it up with Ms. Winslow." That night, I ripped the sign out of the ground and tossed it onto the growing pile of firewood behind my barn. But the HOA didn't stop. They printed newsletters encouraging residents to enjoy the newly designated green space. Soon, HOA families began showing up, strolling through my land as if it were theirs. Children picked apples from my trees. Someone set up a picnic near my pond. A couple even let their dog run through my vegetable beds, trampling young sprouts. I confronted Margaret directly. Get these people off my land. She looked at me with feigned innocence. I'm afraid they have every right to be here, Mr. Carter. It's a community feature now. I took a slow step closer. This isn't over. Margaret's smile never wavered. No, Mr. Carter, it isn't. She had no idea what was coming. I wasn't going to stand by while my land was trampled by entitled strangers. If Margaret wanted to play games, I was going to change the rules. First, I installed motion-activated sprinklers throughout my property, setting them to full blast whenever someone stepped beyond my fence. The first time a group of HOA members strolled through, they were met with a sudden ice-cold spray. Shrieks filled the air as they fled back to their SUVs, soaked to the bone. Complaints flooded the HOA board, but I had posted clear signs. Active irrigation, enter at your own risk. Next, I brought in goats. Dozens of them. They roamed freely, devouring every decorative plant the HOA had tried to install along my fence line. The so-called walking path they had carved in my orchard, the goats made quick work of it, leaving nothing but churned dirt and the occasional pellet behind. Then I took things further. Late one night, I erected my own sign at the entrance to Winslow Estates. Warning: active farm zone. Entering without permission may result in exposure to chemicals, pesticides, and unpredictable livestock. The HOA board held an emergency meeting the next day, but I wasn't done yet. Margaret had tried to tighten her grip on my land, but she had no idea that I had control over something far more important. Margaret Winslow relied on something essential, something that ran straight through my property. I controlled her power source, and I was about to turn off the lights. Margaret's pristine neighborhood, with its meticulously trimmed lawns and gleaming homes, thrived on an electrical substation located, unfortunately for her, on the far end of my property. Decades ago, my grandfather had allowed the power company to run lines through our land under a private contract. That contract had an expiration date, and it was up. I spent an afternoon going through my grandfather's old paperwork in the farmhouse office, dust motes swirling in the golden light, filtering through the window. Finally, I found it, the agreement. The power company had been granted access to run transmission lines through our property for a fixed term. If the contract wasn't renewed, the landowner, me, had the right to revoke access. A slow grin spread across my face as I read through the clauses. The power company had never bothered to renegotiate, likely assuming the deal would roll over indefinitely. And that meant I had control over a very, very important part of Winslow Estate's infrastructure. I wasted no time. The next morning, I made the call. Carter Farm. I said when the power company's regional office picked up. I want to discuss an expired land use agreement. There was a pause. Can you provide the contract reference number? I read it off, hearing the shuffling of papers on the other end. A moment later, the representative cleared his throat. Mr. Carter, I see that the agreement for transmission access through your property expired last year. That's right, and I'd like to exercise my right to terminate it. A long silence. Sir, are you aware that terminating the agreement would cut power to the entire Winslow Estates community? I am. Another pause. We strongly advise against this. You'd be affecting hundreds of homes. Hundreds of homes have been treating my land like a public park without my permission. If the HOA want my land, they can figure out how to live without my electricity. Sir, we'll need to escalate this request to our legal department. You do that, I said and hung up. Within hours, the HOA had caught wind of what I was doing. Margaret herself came storming up my driveway, her usual composed mask slipping into something closer to desperation. You can't do this, she hissed, clutching the HOA's official paperwork in her manicured fingers. Oh, but I can, I said, holding up my grandfather's contract. And I am. Her eyes scanned the document, her lips pressing into a thin, bloodless line. This is extortion. I crossed my arms. No, Margaret, what you did was extortion. You tried to take my land without my consent. You let your residents trample my property. You installed a sign claiming my farm as your own. And now You get to experience what it's like to have something taken away. She bristled, drawing herself up. The HOA will sue. Good luck with that, I said. By the time you get a court date, your fancy neighborhood will have spent weeks in the dark. Her nostrils flared. We will fight this. You do that, I said with a smirk. In the meantime, you might want to start investing in candles. 2 days later, the power company shut down the substation. Winslow Estates was plunged into darkness. It was beautiful. The fallout was immediate. Without power, the air conditioning in the massive, glass-windowed homes failed. Refrigerators stopped running. Food spoiled. The neighborhood's automated sprinkler system shut off, and the once pristine green lawns began browning in the summer heat. At night, the streets, once illuminated by soft LED lamps, became a pitch-black maze of outrage. The HOA held an emergency meeting by candlelight in the community center, desperate to find a solution. Their problem? The only way to restore power was to renegotiate with me. Margaret came back, this time with 2 HOA board members in tow. They were all trying to keep their composure, but I could see the frustration boiling just beneath the surface. We're prepared to discuss terms, Margaret said through clenched teeth. I smiled. Oh, now you want to negotiate. One of the board members, a heavy-set man in a too-tight suit, wiped sweat from his brow. Look, Mr. Carter, this has gotten out of hand. We can find a way to work together. I leaned back against my porch railing. Funny, that's what I said when you tried to claim my land as a botanical garden. You didn't want to work together then. Margaret's jaw tightened. What do you want? I held up a piece of paper. 1. A legally binding agreement that the HOA will never again attempt to claim any part of my property. Margaret's lips pressed together, but she gave a sharp nod. Fine. 2. I continued, a formal public apology from the HOA, printed in your next community newsletter, admitting that you had no legal right to my land. Margaret looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, but after a long silence, she nodded. Fine. And 3, I said, my grin widening. You will personally oversee the removal of every single public botanical garden sign you installed on my land. By hand. Margaret's hands clenched at her sides. I could almost hear her teeth grinding. This is humiliating. You should have thought of that before you tried to steal from me, I said. She glared at me for a long moment, then exhaled sharply. Fine. The next morning, I sat on my porch with a fresh cup of coffee, watching as Margaret, dressed in her usual pristine blazer and heels, trudged through my fields, pulling down the very sign she had erected. The first rays of sunlight glowed across my land, casting long shadows as she yanked the final post out of the soil. The power was restored that afternoon. Winslow Estates never bothered me again. The HOA learned a valuable lesson that day. Power, real power, didn't come from fancy legal jargon or a committee vote. It came from knowing when to fight back. And sometimes it came from knowing exactly where the power lines ran. The HOA had conceded, but their surrender left behind a bitter wound. While Winslow Estates residents rejoiced as the lights flickered back on and their homes hummed with renewed life, Margaret's reputation lay in tatters. The woman who had once ruled with an iron fist had been brought to her knees, not by a legal battle, not by bureaucracy, but by the very thing she had taken for granted, power, both literal and figurative. But I knew Margaret wasn't done. A woman like her didn't take humiliation lightly. It was only a matter of time before she made her next move. A week passed. Then, too, the HOA newsletter came out, featuring the printed apology I had demanded. It was as reluctant as I expected, each word written through gritted teeth. But Margaret had followed through, or so I thought. One morning, as I strolled across my land, surveying the now undisturbed fields that had once been trampled by entitled suburbanites, something caught my eye. A thin white paper fluttered against my fence, secured with a single staple. I pulled it off and read the heading. Eminent domain hearing, notice of review. A cold, sinking feeling settled in my gut. Margaret had changed tactics. Instead of playing her game through the HOA, she had taken it to the county. She was trying to have my land seized under eminent domain, a legal loophole that would allow the government to claim private property for supposed public use. And the hearing was in 3 days. I drove straight to the county clerk's office, where a bored-looking woman barely glanced up as I stormed in. I need to know who filed for an eminent domain review on my property. I demanded. She sighed and tapped at her keyboard. After a moment, she turned the monitor my way. Here's a petition. It was submitted by Margaret Holloway, acting as a representative of the Winslow Estates Homeowners Association. I clenched my fists. On what grounds? She scrolled down. It says here, the Carter Farm represents an underutilized community resource that would better serve the public as a maintained green space and botanical garden, increasing property values and contributing to the local economy. I barely restrained a growl. That's a load of... The clerk held up a hand. Look, Mr. Carter, I'm just reading what's here. But if you want to fight it, you'll need to present your case at the hearing. I left the office, my mind already working through my next steps. Margaret had pushed things too far. She had turned this into a war, and I was about to end it for good. The day of the hearing arrived. The county chambers were packed. Residents from Winslow Estates filled the seats, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. Margaret sat at the front, impeccably dressed, her poise carefully rehearsed. The HOA board flanked her like a personal jury. I took my seat on the opposite side. The commissioner, an older man with weary eyes, called the meeting to order. We are here today to review the petition filed by Winslow Estates Homeowners Association regarding the Carter Farm. Margaret stood first. She spoke in that refined, persuasive tone she had perfected over years of HOA dictatorship. Commissioner, the Winslow Estates community believes that Mr. Carter's land is an invaluable public resource. With proper stewardship, it could become a botanical garden, a space for families to enjoy, and an asset to the local economy. I folded my arms, unimpressed. She continued, the farm is largely unused. It is unkempt, overgrown, and does not contribute meaningfully to the community around it. We are simply proposing a better use of this space, one that benefits everyone. The commissioner nodded. Thank you, Ms. Holloway. Mr. Carter, your response? I rose, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make the room restless. Then I spoke. My family has owned this land for generations. It is private property, and I have never given permission for it to be used by anyone else. Yet, the Winslow Estates HOA took it upon themselves to install signs, trample through my fields, and claim my farm as their own without legal justification. I let my words hang before continuing. This isn't about community benefit. This is about entitlement. Ms. Holloway and her HOA attempted to bully me into submission, and when that failed, they resorted to legal maneuvering. But let's be clear. Their desire to turn my farm into a public space is not about civic duty. It's about control. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. I saw doubt flicker across the commissioner's face. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder. And to prove that, I have documents showing that Winslow Estates has no financial plan, no maintenance budget, and no formal agreements to manage a public space. This petition is built on empty promises. The HOA board shifted uncomfortably. I held up another document. And here is proof that Margaret Holloway herself has been selling the idea of an HOA-controlled park to potential homebuyers in Winslow Estates. She's been marketing land that doesn't belong to her. Gasps filled the room. Margaret's expression twisted, but she remained silent. The commissioner studied the documents before sighing. It is clear that this petition is not based on a legitimate public need. The request for eminent domain is denied. Applause erupted from the gallery. Margaret's face was pale, her hands gripping the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had lost. And this time, there was no coming back from it. I turned to leave, feeling the weight of victory settle over me. But before I stepped out, I leaned in close to Margaret and whispered, "You should have quit while you were ahead." She didn't respond, because she knew, as well as I did, that her reign was over, and the Carter Farm was mine, forever. Winslow Estates changed after that. The HOA, humiliated and weakened, lost much of its grip. Margaret resigned a month later, citing personal reasons. No one bought it. As for me, I went back to tending my land, free from interference, free from entitled suburbanites trying to claim what was never theirs. They had tried to steal my farm, but in the end, all they had lost was their power, and I had never felt more at home. The battle was over, but the scars it left behind on Winslow Estates and its once feared HOA would never fully fade. Margaret Holloway had retreated into obscurity, her iron grip on the neighborhood shattered. No one spoke about her much anymore, except in whispers, the kind reserved for cautionary tales. The HOA, once a formidable force, had lost its bite. New leadership emerged, ones who knew better than to pick a fight they couldn't win. But for me, the war had left something else behind, an opportunity. With my land secured and no further threats looming, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The trespassing, the signs, the power struggle, and finally, the attempt to strip me of my rights through eminent domain. Margaret had wanted to turn my land into a community space, but she had done it through force, deceit, and arrogance. And yet, the idea itself wasn't without merit. I had spent my life guarding the Carter farm, fending off those who sought to take it from me. But perhaps there was another way, a way to ensure the land remained mine while offering something to the community on my own terms. I reached out to the county. Mr. Carter, the commissioner, said, clearly surprised to hear from me. What can we do for you? I want to open my land to the public, I said, but on my terms. A few months later, the Carter Heritage Farm and Wildlife Reserve was officially established. It wasn't a botanical garden, nor was it an HOA-controlled green space. It was something else entirely, something that honored my family's legacy while creating a space that could be appreciated by those who respected it. A section of the farm was turned into a nature reserve, protected from development and preserved for local wildlife. Trails were carved through the land, but only where they wouldn't disturb the natural ecosystem. Visitors could come, but only under strict guidelines. No HOA, no entitled suburbanites claiming ownership, just a piece of land open to those willing to respect it. And best of all, the HOA had no say in it. The grand opening was modest, but meaningful. People from outside Winslow Estates came first, hikers, bird watchers, families looking for a quiet retreat. Then, slowly, a few of the more reasonable residents of Winslow Estates started trickling in. Some approached me cautiously, wary of how I'd react. I just want to say, an older man from the neighborhood told me, we never agreed with what Margaret did. Your land, your family's history, it's special. Thank you for sharing it. I nodded, offering a small smile. As long as it's respected, it'll always be here. That was the difference between me and Margaret. She had wanted control. I had wanted peace. And I had won. One afternoon, just as the sun dipped low in the sky, painting the fields in gold and amber, I saw someone standing at the edge of the property line. A familiar figure, watching silently. Margaret. She wasn't in one of her power suits this time. She wasn't flanked by board members. She looked smaller somehow, stripped of the authority she had once wielded like a weapon. I could have ignored her. I could have walked away. But instead, I approached. She turned as I neared, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, we stood in silence, two former adversaries looking over the land that had been the battleground of our war. You won, she finally said, her voice quiet. Yes, I replied. I did. Another pause. Then, to my surprise, she let out a breath of laughter, shaking her head. I underestimated you. That was your mistake. She nodded, eyes drifting across the fields. I lost everything, you know. The HOA, my standing, my influence. I had to sell my house. Move away. I said nothing. I wasn't sure what she wanted from me. An apology? Redemption? Forgiveness? Instead, I simply asked, so why are you here? She hesitated, then gestured toward the trails, the newly marked signs welcoming visitors. I wanted to see what you did with it. I studied her face, looking for malice, for resentment. But I saw none. Come on, I said after a moment. I'll show you. And for the first time in our long war, we walked side by side, not as enemies, but as two people who had finally found a way to coexist. The land was mine. The fight was over. And Carter Farm would stand, long after we were gone, a testament to resilience, justice, and the simple truth that no one, not even an HOA, could take what wasn't theirs. And that was a legacy worth leaving behind.